Hi, and in the last week in particular, due to a video I was watching last Saturday, I've been thinking quite a lot more about Warhammer. I used to play a lot of Warhammer before World of Warcraft came along. And I was starting to think of the Warhammer games that I sort of went through before eventually playing, the premier version Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then my own journey through the different Warcraft games before playing World of Warcraft, and noticed there's an awful lot of parallels, quite disturbing actually. So I thought I'd go through it here. Making this video essentially for Patreon content. I'm not really sure whether it's the sort of video really to put up on the YouTube channel. Maybe the patrons can say whether it be suitable or not, I don't know. If you're watching this and you're not a patron, then it means they said yes, so I'll have put it up there. But just in terms of that, at the end of Patreon videos, obviously I'm going to give a shout out to the people who contribute the most there. But in particular, I think I really need to sort of vocally thank a few people in particular who have supported for quite a while and a lot, too much in fact, with some. Strifers, for example, Ken Paul, Carl Johan Mattingsdal, and in particular, Bjorn Karlqvist, who supported me for a very long time, and blimey, and it does go to good use. I promise you. There's things I basically use the money from Patreon to fund various subscriptions to things and programs and hardware sometimes as well. Some of which I wouldn't need if I weren't doing the channel, but at the same time, with doing the channel, it also helps to be able to do that as well. So, yes, Warhammer. So, my first foray into any Warhammer games was Hero Quest. And this was a basic tabletop role-playing game. Now, at the time, I had played Dungeons & Dragons, so I'd played a game that was very pencil and paper, and you had a few things on the table to give you some visual impressions. But much more complicated than, say, Hero Quest. Hero Quest, very, very basic, very accessible. And I didn't get it myself, a friend had it. So we went over there, and it was actually really good fun. And it was the sort of thing you could just play the game, and, the next time you played it, you played a different game. There was no continuation or anything like that. It was very, very basic, but it was a lot of fun, very accessible. It didn't take a long time to have people explain the rules to you or anything like that. It was a good thing for a few people to get around. And I was thinking, well, so that's Hero Quest. And my first foray into Warcraft was Warcraft 1, Orcs vs. Humans. And that also was a similar situation. I didn't get it myself. I didn't have a PC at the time. I had an Atari ST. But a friend of mine who did have a PC, he also had the game. So he introduced me to it. And I liked all aspects of it. When I eventually did get a PC, when I went to university, Warcraft was one of the first games I got. And I enjoyed both the solo campaign, even though it was very, very basic, much like Hero Quest, super basic. And I liked the playing against his friend as well. He would always sort of play orcs, I'd play humans. Very different styles as well. In fact, it was from Warcraft 1, I've said this before, that I sort of wanted to be an alliance player when eventually it came to World of Warcraft. And it doesn't come from storylines in Warcraft 2 or Warcraft 3, which are much more fleshed out storylines. It's not the storyline reasons, really, why I prefer Alliance, or what hooked me into Alliance in the first place, even though now I would say I prefer the storylines. It was actually Warcraft 1. And the reason for that is that my friend, who was a much more aggressive player, be one of those who strikes out very quickly, tries to find you really quickly and close you down really quickly. I was much more of a build of defensive base. Look after your own base, and then start to, obviously you'd need to explore to find resources. But in terms of engaging, I wouldn't look to engage early. I'd be much more defensive. He was much more aggressive. And I found it useful to be humans because they're the ranged guys. Orcs had spearmen, humans had, crossbowmen. And the orc archers had longer range. They were weaker. Each individual was weaker, but they had longer range. So the idea was, if he came poking his head in, I would have some archers there. And it doesn't matter that they were weak. All of them firing at once at whoever pokes their head in, dead, from a much longer range before they could start to attack. So that was the idea, that I'd be able to get not only an early warning, because they can fire much more quickly, but, I'd have more control over taking down troops from a greater range before I could start to have damage inflicted on me. So that appealed to me. That appealed to me, and that sort of stuck all the way through. And even when Warcraft 3, which I'll talk about in a bit, this may go on for some time, by the way. Warcraft 3, I really liked the undead. I loved the undead. You're always sort of playing the human side, because, you know, that really did appeal. Anyway, so the big parallels there in that, you know, went round to a friend's house who had it, started to enjoy it, then got it myself. But they were both very, very basic games. So then came, you know, sort of sequels to it in a way. Now, with Hero Quest, later came Advanced Hero Quest, which you don't always hear a lot about. I don't think it was a big success. I don't know commercially how it did. But I got it and I played it. And it definitely had updated systems. There were things about it that you know, were a bit better. It allowed a bit more continuation. You could always sort of play and then continue. It had that development that you could do over a series of games. But it also had a lot of messiness about it. I mean, there was one good thing. It had a solo player version as well, which I suppose is sort of nice. But at the same time, with games like this, you actually want to play it with other people anyway. And then the other thing, like, for example, with your 4 Dungeoneers, you had these tiles that you could put out, which was also good, because that made it much less restrictive. Then there was something nice about having the board for Hero Quest, but at the same time, you know, having a much more free-flowing dungeon was also good. But with your heroes, you had your 4 heroes, you could actually hire men-at-arms as well, so you could put those ahead as basically arrow fodder. The problem is you could actually get quite a few of them, and you'd end up just pressed in this dungeon, the whole corridor with just your whole party of like over a dozen characters effectively, which didn't work out too well. It was a bit silly. So, you know, there were updated systems where certainly some improvements, but the overall experience was not that great. I didn't play many games of it. In fact, really, I would describe the only games I played of it were test games with friends, because it was not, the overall package was not great. And that also has parallels with what I found with Warcraft 2. Warcraft 2, on the face of it, is better. It's very difficult to go, no, it's not as good as Warcraft 1. The storyline was a lot better. The solo campaign was. I didn't enjoy quite a lot of aspects of it, though. I didn't enjoy the naval aspects of it. And just overall, I didn't enjoy it as much. So even when I had Warcraft 2, I don't think I got Warcraft 2 when it first came out, much like I didn't get Warcraft 1 when it first came out. But when I did get it, I still played Warcraft 1 more often, particularly against other players, because I preferred the multiplayer, you know, player versus player version of Warcraft 1 than Warcraft 2. I just enjoyed the overall Warcraft 1. It was, you know, so Warcraft 2, as I say, it added in some better systems, but the overall package just didn't seem to work for me. But where the Warhammer role-playing game really took off for me, so Advanced Hero Quest was, you know, a nice improvement in some ways, but the overall experience was not great, was Warhammer Quest. Warhammer Quest was absolutely fantastic. I still have it. I mean, I still have these games. Over the years, actually, some of my Warhammer stuff I have had to sell off for, you know, various reasons, whether either because moving to a smaller place or just because, you know, money was tight. There's been times in the past when money's been super tight, and I've had, you know, very valuable things, and I've had to sell them off on eBay some time ago. But I've got most stuff, you know, and I do have all those board games still. And Warhammer Quest was absolutely fantastic, and you could develop characters on it, and you could go, and it was always a great experience. It had all of the advancement improvements of Advanced Hero Quest, only much better, and the overall experience was better than Hero Quest. It was quite accessible as well. If you had someone who'd never played it before, it was very easy to show them what to do, and because you have multiple players anyway, it's easy to guide them through the more complex bits, which were actually often the between dungeons things. You know, and you could level up your characters. You could keep the same characters. If your characters died, then they died. You know, obviously as players you can make up your own rules. But if you weren't able to revive them in a reasonable amount of time, they were dead. So you could also end up losing your characters and having to just create a new one. There were rules for other characters that came out, so you could have a bit of variety of the heroes you had as well. It was an absolutely fantastic system. And I would still enjoy playing it today if I had people to come around and play it, because it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely amazing. And similarly with Warcraft 3, when Warcraft 3 came out, it was like, okay, I can now move on from Warcraft 1. You know, it was looking a bit dated by then as well, but it was just so much, still enjoyable. But Warcraft 3 was like, do you know what, it's just better in every way. It was better in every way. The solo campaign, the storylines were fantastic. The cinematics were amazing. But even the player versus player experience was really good as well. There were some aberrations, like if you played Night Elves, you know, because the way they harvested the lumber, instead of just chopping trees down, because apparently that's not a very good Night Elf thing to do. So they had the wisps that harvested it, but without actually removing the trees. But the issue is that sometimes when you're harvesting lumber, you do it for two reasons. One, you want the lumber itself, but two, to clear a path, to be able to expand your base or to create routes to things like the gold mines and stuff like that. So that didn't happen. So you ended up having to have bolt throwers to just basically destroy the forest to do the same thing. Because you still had to do the same thing. You still needed to expand. You still needed to cut paths through to other areas. And you would do that with bolt throwers. So you'd end up with loads of lumber because the wisps didn't have to keep coming backwards and forwards like peons. So you're peasants. But yeah, you would just end up destroying trees and not even using the lumber. It just seemed a bit weird to me, but that's how they solved that one. And the undead, of course, similar situation with the gold, so there was no downsides to it. So you had your guys who would just go around the gold mine and it would just automatically appear you. They didn't have to shuffle backwards and forwards. That appealed. I really actually liked the undead ones. But yeah, the game, and it, you know, it had expansions and much like Warhammer Quest did. And you know, it was in terms of the RTS, that was the pinnacle for me. And I played that for quite a few years and didn't really go back to Warcraft 1 after that. There was no need to. And the same thing with Warhammer Quest. There's no need to play Hero Quest anymore. Why would I? And then when I went to university, where I was still playing Warhammer Quest, because there were some guys at university who played that. Someone I met said, you might like to play Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Now, Warhammer Fantasy Battle didn't appeal to me because I thought, you know, it's nice having the dungeon crawl thing. But I thought, you know, I'd seen pictures, I'd seen it in Games Workshops, particularly in Manchester. I went to university in Manchester, large city. It had a huge Games Workshop store, absolutely massive. I was not happy when the IRA bombed it. So mean. But it was huge. So you saw a lot of games going on there. And it just didn't appear. There's these huge armies and it's like moving things then, measuring things and all that sort of stuff. It all just seemed a bit tedious to me. And I didn't think I'd be really into it. But what was really interesting was the previous summer I'd been to a Metro Centre in Newcastle, I think it was. Big shopping centre. Or big shopping centre for the UK anyway. It's probably a tiny one compared to Americans. And I'd gone into the Games Workshop there, and I just wanted a book, and I bought a Skaven army book, not to play Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It wasn't for the rules, but they had stories and stuff like that in it. And I read that, and then I found I actually really liked it, and I loved the Skaven. And I'd been talking to this guy about it, about the fact I really like this army book, and he said, "Well, I know someone who's got a Skaven army. Maybe you'd like to play them." So he convinced me, and I went along, and I did. I enjoyed it. I liked it a lot, and I think one of the things that helped me like it a lot was the fact that it was Skaven I was playing, because they were basically like the goblins of Warhammer in that they have these contraptions, and sometimes they work amazingly well, and sometimes they're a disaster. And one particular thing was there was a doom wheel. Which, you know, he'd chosen the army for me. There's a doom wheel in it. And it could carve through things really well. You could do loads and loads of damage with it. But there was a chance it could go haywire and then mince your own army up as well. And that's exactly what happened. I was doing loads of damage with it. And then all of a sudden it went berserk and went through my own army. I thought, oh. But it was really good fun, and I started to get into it. So then I got my Skaven book when I got back to my flat, and I was reading through the rules parts of it as well, and coming up with my own armies. And that friend, friend of a friend really, although I became friends with him, let me sort of come up with my own armies. Sort of what models have you got? Okay, great. And then, when I left university, I just started to get my own stuff with it. And eventually got really into it and started to go to the tournaments, the grand tournaments at Warhammer World, which I thought were fantastic. I absolutely loved those. I went there with those for several years. I used to go to Games Day as well down in Birmingham, the annual convention. Really enjoyed that. And it and then World of Warcraft came out. Now, coming to the World of Warcraft, it's parallel again. I didn't think I would enjoy it. I knew it was coming out. I was playing Warcraft 3 at the time, and I was reading news on it, so I knew that World of Warcraft was coming, but it didn't appeal to me. And again, it was just down to, a slightly different reason, but it was down to, well, you're going to have loads and loads of players all in one that I don't know, complete strangers. And I knew what the internet was like. I'd already familiarised myself with the internet at the time. And it was full of idiots. And I thought, well, why would I want to have my gaming experience ruined by imbeciles that I don't even know? And I thought, well, I don't, so I'm not going to get it. But then a friend who was living with me at the time, and there's actually a bit of an anti-parallel here, but he persuaded me to get it. It didn't take that much persuading, because to be honest, being a Warcraft fan, it wasn't only really a nudge. The fact that a friend of mine would recommend it straight away gets you thinking, well, we do like similar things, so you like it, maybe I'll like it. And, and I just sort of asked him, well, can you play Paladin? He said, yes, okay, I'll get it. I got it the next day. But the anti-parallel aspect of this one is, so with both of them, I was very hesitant and had to be persuaded. But when I got into them, I loved it straight away, and immediately. So my fears were completely unfounded on both cases. But the irony is that the friend who persuaded me to play World of Warcraft, I had got him into Warhammer. So, because when I got back from university and I love Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I started to get some things for myself, build it up, and this friend was, we all sort of got interested. And he now works at Warhammer World as an illustrator. He works for Games Workshop. Although there the parallels end. I don't work for Blizzard, and I never intend to. I never will. So, but they're a little weird anti-parallel there. But, and this is where it takes a slightly more sinister. I mean, there's little parallels you can also talk about with World of Warcraft. We've had expansions. With each expansion, the way the game is played changes. Of course, Warhammer Fantasy Battle has had different editions as well. The first edition I played was, is it 4th or 5th? I think it might have been the back end of 4th, and then 5th came out. And then, so that's what I was playing when I got back from university. And then 6th edition came out, and that's when I started to do it much more seriously. And but what happened was, and I was, the thing is, when I started playing World of Warcraft, it was a very quick switch. I wasn't like doing Warhammer Fantasy Battle and World of Warcraft. There was a period where it sort of gelled. I didn't instantly stop playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle, but it did happen very, very quickly. And there were a few reasons for this. It wasn't just that I thought World of Warcraft was better than Warhammer Fantasy Battle. When I went to those tournaments and I was playing those 2,000 point games, that was more fun than anything I've done in World of Warcraft. So you'd think to yourself, well, why would you have gone more into World of Warcraft? And it's because you spend very little time doing that. That was 2 tournaments a year. There were other tournaments as well, and I went to a few of those, but they were only like 1,500 point ones. I didn't find those as enjoyable. I still found them enjoyable. And you could go, there was games nights at the local Games Workshop store I used to go to each week, but they were usually, again, at max 1,500 points aside, often more like 1,000 points aside. Again, fun, okay, but not as, not as fun, not as interesting for me. the real love for me was the 2,000 point aside games. And Games Workshop already at the time was starting to do funny things to the grand tournaments, things that I, introducing changes that I didn't like and I knew I wasn't going to enjoy. And of course, it's a lot of work and hassle to get yourself to the grand tournaments. I didn't live in the same city. I'm not lived that far away. But anyway, I can do stories on Warhammer if people want me to later on separately. The point is that there was a bit of a decline in what would have been my enjoyment in Warhammer Fantasy Battle and, of course, World of Warcraft coming out. So it was easy to switch from one to the other. Especially as I played more and more World of Warcraft, it got to the point where it was impossible to put in the amount of time to both anyway. So I had to choose. World of Warcraft was simply more accessible to me than Warhammer Fantasy Battle in terms of finding other players because they were ready, they were there. And they weren't such imbeciles as I'd first thought as well. Some were. But most weren't. Most were actually, decent. And yeah, so, but what has happened since I've been away from Warhammer, where I've not been keeping close tabs on it, because I was quite, I was getting quite involved in the community side of it as well. I had a website and I was doing things on that, and that was getting some good attention. And I have no doubt that in the fullness of time, if I'd stayed with it, I'd have ended up having a YouTube channel on Warhammer Fantasy Battle and probably doing a lot better as well because, But it is no longer supported by Games Workshop. What had happened was, another edition had come out, which was completely royally arsed up, as far as I can tell, by Games Workshop, to the point where they just saw Warhammer Fantasy Battle as a financial liability, and now it doesn't exist. Or, it sort of does, because there's nothing to stop people playing it, but it's not supported by the company. And then I started to think, again, in terms of the mortality of World of Warcraft itself. Now, there's been, all through World of Warcraft's history, there's been people saying how, oh, it's dying. It's not dying. It's not as popular as it was, of course, but it is still the king of MMOs. However, in Blizzard's own words,
no king rules forever, my son.
So there will come a time when it ends, and I don't know when that will be. All I do know, and what I've said for a great long time, really, is it will end when Blizzard wants it to end. I mean, it's still extremely lucrative. Although we don't know how many people are playing it, we can try and surmise these things. There are ways to try and work out rough estimates, but we can't know because Blizzard no longer reveal those figures. But we know that it's financially more than viable. In fact, so financially strong that it's difficult to imagine another Warcraft game coming anytime soon. But you know that when World of Warcraft does end, there will be another game to take over. The franchise will continue. And I have been wondering lately, because in Legion, of course, we basically eliminated the Legion as a threat to us. And in BFA, it may well be, because there's Old God links there, maybe we're going to sweep away the Old Gods as a threat to us. It certainly feels to me like they're clearing the decks for something. Not necessarily a new game, it could just be a completely new direction for the story of World of Warcraft. But maybe they are clearing the decks for the end of World of Warcraft. They won't tell us when they're planning on doing it. They will only tell us when World of Warcraft's going to end, when they're ready for that. But at some point, I mean, it's one of these things with a physical game, including Warhammer Fantasy Battle. If someone says this thing's going to be around for decades, no one bats an eyelid. But when it's a computer game, people go, no. Games have a shelf life. World of Warcraft has bucked that trend, even amongst other MMOs. It's still going. It's like the Hubble Space Telescope of computer games. It keeps going long past the time when you thought it would have stopped. But at some point it will. And I was digging something out when I was looking through my Warhammer stuff, and I came across this. Let's see that there. This is the Grand Tournament pack, Little rules pack. Obviously, you play the rules in the manual, but specific rules for the tournaments. And, you know, I look at the date on this, Games Workshop 2004. So, without particularly remembering this, this must have been the last tournament season I attended, because the following year I was playing World of Warcraft. The following year also, I seem to remember, is when they were introducing a shake-up of rules, which I didn't approve of. So for that reason, I think that's why I didn't go the following season. This was, you know, I'm quite sure of it, the last season I attended. And it sort of brought it to me. I was looking through these books, and looking through that, and I'm thinking there is one big difference with Warhammer, because they have basically killed off that game now. But there's nothing to stop me getting more models. I mean, most of the models I had to sell because I was moving to, you know, a place where I wouldn't be able to store them, which was a bit of a shame. But you know. But, you know, I would be able to, Games Workshop, I'm fairly sure, I'm out of the loop for a long time, but I'd be fairly sure I'd be able to still order models and get models to be able to build myself some armies. There are still rule books there. You might not be able to buy them easily from Games Workshop, but you can still get hold of them. You know, it might even be possible to find people. I think there's even tournaments still carried out, community-based tournaments. So, in theory, I'd still be able to play Warhammer Fantasy Battle. It's just no longer being developed. Whereas with World of Warcraft, you can't. I mean, this is why a lot of people are asking for Classic WoW. They're very excited about it, because it's a form of the game that they enjoyed that they can't play, except on private servers, because you don't have physical copies of the game. You have, even when you had discs, you know, because it's all online. It's all online. So when Blizzard pull the plug, they've pulled the plug. You can't be able to play it anymore. So that's, I suppose, one advantage of this stuff again. But the parallel, where I hope it ends, is, so what happened with Warhammer? So it became mismanaged. It was mismanaged and therefore took a big financial hit. Really, because with Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I gather the way it was at the end, people were saying you basically, if you were going to get someone into it, you were telling them you're going to have to spend hundreds of pounds or dollars or whatever. Which obviously someone just getting into a game is not going to do that. Bear in mind the way I got into the game was using someone else's models. That's the best way to get into it. But you didn't have to, even at the time. I could have just bought a copy of the game, which was like at the time £40–50. And that included everything you would need to be able to play the game. You could play the game on a very slow scale, and then you could add to it and just scale it up all the time. So it was very accessible. But then apparently it became not so accessible, you know. Probably just out of greed. They were probably thinking to themselves, well, we're making it too easy by letting people have small armies. We should make them have bigger armies. They've got to spend more money. But then without realising that actually people don't have that much money to spend. And I also imagine the financial crash probably hit it as well. Obviously, the first thing people are going to do without is expensive luxuries, you know, when money's tighter. So they went with this Age of Sigmar thing, which is basically just buy a few models and use whatever models you've got is what you use in the game. It's not very tight. It's not the sort of game you can play competitively, it looks to me, because I've been looking at it a little bit recently. It doesn't really look like something you can play competitively. Which means, of course, tournaments, if there were tournaments even existing for it, would be a load of crap. Not the sort of thing that would appeal to me. So if ever I sort of thought about getting back into it, which I have done every now and then, especially when I've got more room now, I could easily create a little area for painting models and stuff like that again. The option's sort of gone, because I would have to find people who'd want to play it. And again, this idea that it won't be developed, won't be supported, is also not appealing. But again, I was just thinking in terms of World of Warcraft, at some point they're going to stop it. And then you think what's going to come next. And a lot of people, you know, lots of people will be thinking lots of different things. Do I really think they're going to do another World of Warcraft MMO, like a more modern version, updated? Because World of Warcraft it does very well in that it's clearly dated. There's a lot of, not only, you know, graphically, but the graphics was a particular style choice. But in terms of systems, at the same time, whenever the new expansion comes out, they always manage to make it feel like it is updated. It's old-fashioned and modern at the same time. So it gets away with it. But yeah, the idea of another World of Warcraft MMO coming out with much more updated ideas, more modern, refreshing, appeals to me. But do I think they're going to do it? No. I worry that World of Warcraft is very like Warhammer Fantasy Battle in terms of accessibility. And I worry that what they would create, if they created another World of Warcraft, and let's say it were an MMO even, what would concern me is I think they would focus much more on the very accessible content and potentially not at all on the less accessible content, mythic raiding, for example. And that what would come would be a game that I would not want to play. So there we go. That's sort of rambling over. Those are sort of my thoughts. But I was just sort of thinking, you know, as I've gone through the Warhammer games, and which also preceded the equivalent Warcraft games, there are these strong parallels between the different ones. A lot of similarities between, you know, Hero Quest, Warcraft 1, Advanced Hero Quest, Warcraft 2, Warhammer Quest, Warcraft 3, you know, and Warhammer Fantasy Battle and World of Warcraft. I just hope that World of Warcraft, the ending of it, isn't like the ending of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But there will be an end at some point, and at which point I don't really know what I will do. Because although, you know, in some ways it might be quite good, well, I'll get to play the other games I like to play, but then I play those on a more casual basis. I always like to have one game that I play seriously. It's nice to have time to play other games as well, but I always sort of need one thing that I get serious about. I mean, at the moment it's World of Warcraft. Before that it was Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Before that it was judo. I used to play judo quite seriously, you know, and I used to go to tournaments and things like that. I like to do something competitively. And I don't know what that would be if Blizzard were to announce, let's say, horror of horrors, that Battle for Azeroth was the last expansion. I don't believe it will be, but let's just say. That would cause a bit of a quandary in me. Cue a midlife crisis, I think, at that point. So anyway, those are sort of my journeys through those particular games. Let me know what you think, obviously, in the comments below. Any sort of experiences you've had with either of those games. And until next time, I'll see you later.